The election manifestos are out. Some of them even have numbers. So at last we can see if the party's promises stack up.
How important is it for someone in your position of power to always tell the truth?
I think it's absolutely vital.
So you're telling us tonight you will remain neutral
Yes.
on the issue of whether or not we should remain within the EU.
First heard here on Question
First heard here on
Time.
Question Time.
Last week, Labour launched its manifesto in Birmingham.
The most radical and ambitious plan to transform our country for decades.
This week, the Tories chose the marginal seat of Telford to publish their plans.
Do we want 2020 to be another year of defeatism and despair? No, we don't. Get Brexit done.
The Brexit Party said it wasn't launching a manifesto, but a contract with the people.
We now want to lead the next phase, which is a political revolution that puts the ordinary people first.
Pensions, or lack of them for the so-called waspy women born in the 1950s, took centre stage.
Are you still in that frame of mind that you're going to help us out?
Listen, I'm going to take a
Put my hands up.
This is their money that they've had stolen off them.
The SNP said Boris Johnson was dangerous and unfit for office. They were prepared to work with other parties in a progressive alliance.
It doesn't appear to be the principle of a second independence referendum.
It could be the timing.
It's quibbling about now, it's the timing.
Accusations of anti-Semitism continue to dog the Labour leader. They came to a head when the chief rabbi said a new poison had taken root in the party.
No
apology for how you've
any
handled
other
this.
form of life.
Try one more time.
No, hang on a
apology.
minute, Andrew.
The Prime Minister was asked if he would apologise for Islamophobia in the Tory party.
Look, of course.
Tonight I'll be speaking to the Conservatives' Robert Buckland.
His government released this. We have since obtained this.
And Labour's Barry Gardiner on their claims the NHS is on the table in US trade talks. Good evening, welcome to Westminster, where I have to report a dismal lack of attention to detail. So sit up at the back, Johnson Jr., pay attention, Corbyn Minor. At the Tory manifesto launch in Telford, the Prime Minister said the local A&E department would be saved by the Tories. We quickly learned it's been downgraded. On Monday night, Scotland's First Minister, a former Health Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, couldn't tell me what percentage of NHS patients were getting treatment within her own government's target. Last night, Jeremy Corbyn didn't know what proportion of income tax is already paid by the top 5% of earners, even though these are the ones he wants to get his extra spending dosh from. As for the Brexit Party, well, their manifesto is the size of a postage stamp. Let's just say detail is not really its thing. So all of you out there, write out 100 times the devil is in the detail and have it on my desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Earlier today, I spoke to the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Barry Gardiner. Barry Gardiner, you and Jeremy Corbyn today brandished detailed leaks of meetings between British and American trade officials. What evidence do they contain that the Tories' plan, as your party claims, to sell off the NHS to Donald Trump's America?
They very clearly set out that they have discussed full access, which means the abolition of the control that we have through NICE of the cost effectiveness of drugs.
Right,
they
but
very
that's
clear
about drugs. What plans do they contain that show the Tories plan to sell off the NHS?
Well, Andrew, you have to understand that the NHS is not a building that you sell. What you do is it's a series of services, and what they're proposing to do is to make those services open so that they can be competed for and against the Americans in a marketplace where they would be sucking millions of dollars out of our NHS, destroying the capacity that we have then to provide other services for our patients.
So it's American competition, you fear, not selling off the NHS to America?
Look,
that's what your party says.
Yes. it's a way of trying to communicate to people that there are different ways in which you can destroy the NHS. One of them is by ensuring that money is sucked out of the system and that costs are increased. And if you look at what Professor Andrew Hill has said, who's an advisor to the World Health Organization, when assessing the relative costs of drugs that we would pay if we were to pay American prices, which is what these trade negotiations show the Americans are wanting to do, it would be an extra 27 billion. At the moment, we pay 18 billion.
Hold on. Our total drugs bill from all over the world is 18 billion.
Yes, indeed.
Not just America, from everywhere.
Yes.
Your leader is saying that a trade deal with America will add 26 billion a year to the drugs bill. How would that work out?
Sorry, it's not the Labour Party that's saying that. This is Professor Andrew Hill, who is the advisor.
Excuse me, Jeremy Corbyn has said that with a free trade deal with America, drugs will go up by 500 million a week,
yes,
which is about 26 billion a
it's
year.
Actually 20,
That's Mr Corbyn. It's almost 27.
It's actually, yes,
How
27
would that be
billion.
if our total drugs bill is only 18 billion?
We're quoting what Andrew Hill, the professor who is the advisor to the World Health Organization, himself has said.
And do you know what assumption he made to get the 26 billion
he said
figure?
if we were paying the same prices as the Americans are paying for those drugs.
What he said was, if we paid American prices for drugs we bought from all over the world, not just American prices. We would say to France, we'll give you American prices too. We'd say to India, we'll give you American prices. It's ludicrous, and you know that that figure is scaremongering.
I'm sorry. We've been very clear in that we've quoted Andrew Hill and exactly what he said.
But his assumption is ludicrous.
It's not ludicrous because, of course, once you engage in a trade agreement with America to big American pharmaceutical companies, those big drug companies, if we're paying that rate to them, and that's what both President Trump and Lighthizer, the trade representative, have both said, they say that we're freeloading on their system. They want us to pay more so that Americans can pay less. We will not accept that. Because that will destroy the funding for the NHS.
That the British side has agreed to that?
What you have is 6 meetings over a period of 2 years in which they have said that they've come to the point where they are now ready to draft the wording that would go into the eventual trade agreement.
No, they're ready to draft the next stage of the negotiations on which they would be based. I ask you again, is there anything in these documents to show that Britain has agreed to any of this?
Andrew, can I just point out that if ministers are allowing civil servants to go off and negotiate this, either they're in control of it, in which they know what's going on, or they're not in control.
Barry Gardner, these are not negotiations. These are scoping out talks.
No.
They are.
Sorry.
For example, let me just come to the point. Are you claiming, as Mr Corbyn did today, that we've agreed to full US market access to Britain?
That is precisely what has been discussed.
Have we agreed to it?
Not yet, because we can't. We can't agree to it at this stage because we haven't left the European Union, as you well know.
You see,
the point is, though, Andrew, that actually all of this is being discussed. And you will remember that when Boris Johnson was on the television the other night, he looked directly into the camera and he said, this is nonsense. This is not happening. He denied that these negotiations were going on. Now, you say they're not negotiations, and technically we can't negotiate with American
and they're scoping talks.
But
let me just say, I've seen all that. Barry Gardner, let me ask you this. And I want to come on to some important things here, but let me ask you this, because you talk about total market access. What the document says, and it's the British describing the American position, because that's what they were there to find out, not to negotiate, to find out the American position. And Mr Corbyn part quoted this bit. The US approach makes total market access the baseline assumption of the trade negotiations. That's an accurate quote. But he didn't go on to repeat the rest of the sentence. What does that say?
Well, you've got it there, so you tell me.
So you don't know?
Well, I've got it here. If you want me to find it, then I'll have to...
Well, I've got it here because you probably won't find it there. It goes on to say, and the US approach requires the other country to identify exclusions. In other words, the US say, we think everything should be on the table, but it's up to you to tell us what you think is not on the table But you didn't add that today, did you?
No, I'm sorry. Actually, if you look at what they've said about the negative list approach, which is precisely this approach that they adopt that says everything should be included unless specifically included. Right. They have...
No, they've said everything should be included unless specifically excluded.
That's what I've just said.
Meaning Britain could exclude what it wants.
The point is...
That's the point.
No, it's not. Because what you have to understand about a negative list system is this, that any future service, any new technological breakthrough in our health service would automatically then be open for attack by the Americans.
And this says we can exclude what we want.
You can't exclude from a trade agreement that which does not exist.
But at the moment we could exclude it, and you didn't quote that second part, which shows you misleading. But you've
absolutely not.
You've not just been misleading as that.
Andrew,
there's a real sniff of scaremongering.
Stop a second, because you've accused me of misleading.
Well, you are misleading.
We can't be misleading when we have given these documents to you in the press. We've made it absolutely transparent. The people who are misleading here is the government, who have for years refused to get these documents into the public domain.
You don't show what you claim. That's why it's misleading. And there's more than a sniff of Labour scaremongering there. Let's just show our viewers what Mr Corbyn, on the back of these documents, emailed to voters today. See what he said. Imagine opening a 5-figure bill for your cancer treatment. Imagine paying to give birth, paying to have a checkup at the GP. This is not only a plot against our NHS, it's a plot against our whole country. Where in these documents does it say we'll be getting 5-figure bills for cancer treatment?
You will recall that in his speech this morning, Jeremy Corbyn actually quoted the differential prices. It was for one particular drug, which is more than 5 times the cost if we get it from America than it is from the way in which we procure it in the UK.
We don't pay. You say, imagine opening a 5-figure bill. In Britain, because of our NHS, we don't get bills. So where does it say we'd end up? Patients would be getting bills.
The point is here, if you're paying so much extra for the drugs that you pay for in the NHS, it means that you cannot, as the NHS, afford to be providing so many other services.
It's a long stretch.
No, it's
not.
Where
does the document say we're going to have to pay for a checkup at the GP?
It doesn't say that.
So why raise that as a possibility?
Well, because it's something that has been mentioned, as you well know, by Tory policy advisors in the past.
It is not Conservative policy.
Not at the moment, it's not.
Where does it say we'd have to pay to give birth in these documents?
Andrew, what it does say in these documents...
No, I'm asking you, where does it say that? Because that's what your leader's claiming.
You see, it's very easy to say what a document doesn't say and just to go through a list. But that's not the point. The point here is that actually the document goes through in a number of ways, not only a negative list, but in the way in which it's talking about the extension of patent life. Because if you extend the patent life from 10 to 20 years, then we are paying the higher price for those drugs during the entirety of that period. These are all the things that have been discussed, which this government said were not being discussed.
And there is no indication in these documents that we've agreed to any of that.
Because we cannot yet. But the point is the government...
Well, you could give indications.
The government
give indications, but there's none.
Andrew, the government claims that this is not being discussed. They've said that these discussions aren't taking place. They've actually had the Prime Minister staring into the camera to state that categorically. But they are taking place.
These discussions...
And it shows precisely the way in which our health service is under attack.
These are important issues for people, because you're talking about birth, you're talking about cancer treatment, you're talking about checkups at the GP, and you're scaring people on the basis of no evidence in that document whatsoever.
I'm sorry.
Document 1 doesn't even mention the NHS.
Andrew.
Document 1 doesn't mention... Document 2...
Sorry.
Document 1 does not mention the NHS. Document 2...
That is a ridiculous and a naive thing to say. And you are too smart a journalist for me to allow you to get away with it. Okay?
I'm sorry. Where does it mention the NHS?
The point is this. The
point is it doesn't mention the NHS.
It talks about services. It talks about pharmaceutical services. It talks about intellectual property rights, which which relate to pharmaceutical services. You know very well that the NHS is absolutely, writ through the entirety of this document because it is about the way in which services are provided, procured and paid for.
Mr. Garber, these documents are about pharma. They're about drugs. That's what these discussions are really about.
And drugs are about the NHS. They are,
but let me finish the question. They are scoping out the nature of what trade talks could be when real negotiations, if and when they begin. The United States is the biggest pharma producer in the world. The United Kingdom is in the top 5 pharma producers in the world. It is inevitable that pharma will be discussed.
Oh. Is
for trade talks.
Well, in that case, you're saying that the Prime Minister is a liar?
No, what I'm saying is...
He said it's not going to be. He said drug prices... I'm sorry.
What I'm telling you
He said drug prices are not going to be discussed. They've said that. This government has said that. And you are now saying it's inevitable.
I'm saying it's inevitable
that is what is happening.
Scoping conversations, the Americans will want to talk pharma.
No, you didn't.
Are you surprised by that?
Sorry, you didn't.
Of course.
Recall what you actually said. What you said is, if and when those negotiations do take place, it is inevitable that drug pricing will be part of it, is what you actually said.
Well,
and that is precisely what this Tory government have denied.
I said it's inevitable that pharma will be discussed. And in that discussion, there will be a discussion about patents. And patents do affect prices, because the longer they're in patent, the more expensive they are.
That's my point.
But all trade talks involve that. The EU, when it negotiated with Canada, wanted longer pharma patent times. There's nothing unusual in that. But you scaremonger on saying we'll get 5-figure bills for cancer treatment.
You know very well that this government has claimed that no talks are taking place that would prejudice the NHS. These talks do prejudice the NHS. They are not yet able to negotiate because we haven't yet left the EU. If and when we do leave the EU, this forms the basis of those talks. And in all the ways that we've been discussing, it means that our NHS is under attack from big American drug companies. In each of the negotiations that America has done, whether it's been with Canada, with Mexico, with other countries, at every stage, the key objective that they have had and the billions of pounds that big American drug companies have put into Congress in their backing for politicians there has been to obtain that objective, and they've succeeded. Because the drug prices in those countries have gone up.
You've had your say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Barry Gardiner speaking earlier to me this evening. Let's now turn to the Conservatives. I'm joined by the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland. Let's stick with the NHS. It's a really important subject. Your colleague Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary, told me last week, I quote, "The price the NHS pays for drugs is not on the table in US-UK trade talks." That's not true, is it?
Well, it is, because as we can see from what's been happening today is a lot of noise and scaremongering about very little at all. The papers refer to talks that happened in some cases some years ago. And
well, back to 2017,
yes.
but took place afterwards as well. And what these papers refer to, because we now have the details, is they show the US is pushing hard, it's the exact word, pushing hard on patent term extension. Now, that's a bit complicated, but what it means is the length of a time a drug is protected by patent has a direct effect on the price. That's what the Americans are pushing. Drug prices are on the table.
And I can hardly see any British government, Conservative or otherwise, seeking to negotiate a deal that means that drug prices would rise, Andrew. I think it's a wholly unrealistic set of circumstances. It's fanciful. It's not on the table.
But the Trade Secretary told me drug prices were not on the table. These documents show they are on the table.
No, there was some discussion of a preliminary nature. That does not mean that this is a negotiation based upon specific requirements. It's the sort of scoping discussion that happens in every free trade agreement.
Right, and in this scoping discussion, the Americans have raised patents, which affect the price of drugs. Drugs protected by patent are much more expensive. It's only when they lose that protection, they become generic, the price then plummets. So if we agree to longer patents, which is what the Americans want, we are agreeing to higher drug prices. Now, we might not agree that's another matter, but it means it's on the table. The documents leave you in no doubt about that.
Well, our rules on patents are somewhat different and more stringent, and I cannot
That's why the Americans have raised it.
Well, indeed. Well, good luck to them, but they're not going to get very far with us because we've made it very clear that that sort of issue is not on the table.
Well, but it is on the... I'm sorry, the documents show it's been on the table at these 6 meetings. Well, and indeed, the British side, as we see from the documents, now acknowledge, they say, the longer you protect, that's the patent, the longer higher prices are maintained. Right. They say, then they ask, is there a trade-off? That's the British side. And you're trying to tell me that drug prices are not on the table?
They're not, because officials might have discussions, but it's the politicians who set those instructions. And we're very clear, as a government, as a party, campaigning in this election, we are not going to instruct officials to negotiate about pharma or about the NHS, period.
Why didn't you tell them, if the Americans bring up the length of patents, just tell them we're not talking about it. Tell them that's not an area we're going to go.
Well, we're not in a negotiation. These were just preliminary discussions.
You've had 6
not
meetings.
committing anything to anyone to anything.
But you had 6
and
meetings.
Frankly, our message has been consistent and clear. The NHS and pharma is not on the table in any future discussion on an FTA, any future negotiation. We've set it out in the manifesto. This is a pathetic attempt, a desperate attempt by a Labour opposition that's clutching at straws.
There is nothing in these documents to say drug prices are not on the table. Nothing.
But what is clear is the political instruction, and we are not going to put those on the table,
well,
period.
It may be a condition of the talks, because I don't think we're in any doubt where the Americans are coming from. We don't need, secret negotiations or leaked documents. President Trump said last year, I've instructed the US trade representative, that's the people in the documents, to make fixing this injustice of low export prices for US drugs, to make that a top priority with every trading partner. So we know what the Americans want.
And indeed, the Obama administration wanted a similar thing. I mean, this issue is not new. The issues around pharma and food standards have always been at the source of dispute between the US and the UK. No, it's not on the table, period.
If the Americans say we want to discuss this, it's got to be part of the trade talks. The president has instructed the US trade talk representative to do it. Are you prepared to make this a deal breaker so that the talks actually don't go any further?
Well, look, we've made it very clear that the NHS or anything to do with it is not on the table in any future talks. That includes pharma. I really think that
so there'll be no trade talks then?
No, of course there will be trade talks.
If the Americans want patent lengths and the price of their drugs on the table, and you say we're not doing that, there will be no trade talks.
No, but these have been arguments that have been around for years, Andrew. Nobody's pretending that this is going to be easy.
It's Mr. Trump's top priority. Now, either we say, all right, we'll discuss it, we're not going to agree with what you want, but it will be on the table, or we say, if that's where you want to go, forget a US-UK free trade deal. Which is it?
No, well, look, I'm very clear, and the government is very clear about this. We do not have the NHS on the table in any of these talks.
So there might not be free trade talks with the Americans?
Well, we've been very clear about it. I think there will
be free trade talks. What I'm trying to work out is if this is really your position, there won't be free trade talks, there won't be a free trade deal.
I don't think you can say that, Andrew. We don't know precisely what the ambit of any future free trade deal might be. It might be a sectoral deal that doesn't involve any of this. It's certainly not this government's intention to put it on the table in any way, shape or form.
There's been a lot of news about the Labour Party and anti-Semitism. Let me talk about the Tory Party and Islamophobia. Mr. Johnson said yesterday that anyone guilty of Islamophobia in the Tory Party is out, quote, on the first bounce. The problem is, you then allow some of them to bounce right back in, don't you?
Well, look, Andrew, I think the record shows that we have been taking swift and immediate action to remove and suspend people who clearly have crossed that line into unacceptable and inappropriate and offensive comments. We are taking this extremely seriously.
The record shows that. How many complaints of Islamophobia by Tory party members have you had?
I don't have the figure in front of me, Andrew.
So
I
we don't have the record.
Following specific examples, looking myself at some of the examples.
How many members have been expelled for Islamophobia?
I don't have the expulsion figure.
So why did you say the record shows if you don't know the record?
Because what I've been looking at is particular recent suspensions, and I'm glad to see that the party's been taking direct and immediate action, even with candidates in this election, to deal with the problem.
Let's look at some recent examples. Mick Murphy was a Conservative councillor in Ashfield, in Notts. He was suspended from the Conservative Party for a highly offensive Islamophobic post. He compared Muslim women's children to black rubbish bags. He was suspended. He was then quietly allowed back in.
Well, look, that's a matter of concern, I think, to any of us. Those remarks are offensive and unacceptable. I think
So the record doesn't show what you claimed.
Well, we're about to take real action on this because the review that we're going to have into Islamophobia and other types of prejudice is going to start. It's going to be independently run, and it's going to be thorough, and it's going to deal with all these issues in a way that I think the public would say is acceptable.
It was only when what happened to Mr. Murphy was rumbled by the media that he was then suspended again. But he wasn't expelled. He hasn't been expelled.
Well, this is why I think looking at the process is going to be very important, because I'm certainly determined to make sure that we root out individuals who have these views.
You say that.
We have a zero-tolerance approach.
But you don't have zero tolerance.
And that the processes are transparent.
You can compare Muslim children to bin bags, and that's not enough to get you expelled from the Conservative Party.
Well, I think that's an offensive and unacceptable remark for any Conservative member
and it's not
to make, and they shouldn't be members.
What about Peter Lamb? He was a former council candidate in Harlow, Essex. He was suspended for a post saying this. Listen to this. Islam is like alcoholism. The first step to recovery is to admit you have a problem. He was suspended. He was then readmitted and accepted as one of your party's candidates.
Well, look, on the face of that again is another comment that crosses the line clearly and is wholly offensive and unacceptable. I haven't had the chance to look into these individual cases. Andrew.
No, I understand that, but this is worrying, is it not?
Well, look, that we deal, and I've admitted and accept that we need to deal with this in a thorough way and make sure that we don't have a repeat of this, and that the party is seen to be dealing swiftly and properly with transgressions.
And that's what all the candidates for the leadership of your party said in the summer. Let me just show you this little clip from one of these debates in July.
Shall we have an external investigation of the Conservative Party into Islamophobia?
Absolutely.
They all agree. Rory, do you agree? Excellent. They agree.
That was in July. You all agreed, including Mr. Johnson was there, now the Prime Minister, leader of your party. There will be an external investigation into Islamophobia. That was July. It's almost December. It hasn't happened.
Well, it's going to start this year, and it will start before the end of the year. It will report next year. It will be independently run. It will be thorough. And I and others will be taking a very close look at it to make sure that the party is actually following any recommendations and complying with the spirit and the letter of procedure.
It's not just about Islamophobia, is it? You're broadening it out now.
Well, we want to make sure that all types of prejudice, whether it's based on race or religion, are dealt with. I think it's important in the context of Islamophobia that we understand that anti-Muslim prejudice, it might be one branch of it, there might be religious-based prejudice. We've got to get this right in order to do a thorough job as possible.
Now is that you're playing the Corbyn card. You ask Mr. Corbyn about anti-Semitism, as I have done, and he starts talking about racism of all kinds. He never zooms in just on the anti-Semitism. Your party leaders there promised an investigation into Islamophobia because from these examples, that's the clear and pressing danger in your party. But now you're going to broaden it out into all sorts of things because you might be frightened of what you find if the searchlight was just on your party's Islamophobia.
Well, Andrew, we're not going to be frightened about going anywhere that the evidence takes us. And if indeed there is a predominance of that particular issue, then that will be focused upon properly. And I think that today's apology by the Prime Minister was an important step. It's an acknowledgement that hurt and distress have been occasioned, and we need to deal with it.
He hasn't given a full apology, though, has he?
Well, he's apologised for the hurt and distress that the combination of different incidents has
He's apologised for Islamophobia. He's not apologised for his contribution towards it.
Well, look, I think that That particular issue was in the context of a defence, actually, of the freedom of people.
All right.
To
Let's leave it there. Come back and see us. I apologise for cutting you off. We just run out of time. I'll be back here with Politics Live at 12 o'clock tomorrow. Next week on BBC One, I'll have more of the Andrew Neil interviews with party leaders. Bye-bye.